thank you very much for stepping in. And I think we're all interested in what you want to talk about, so over to you.
Thank you. I have to say that's a very hard act to follow. And I'm going to give a presentation that's...
in a good way or a bad way?
in a very good way. And I'm going to give a presentation that I hope isn't too dull following that. What I want to talk about is a kind of an unintended experiment that I carried out in a course that I taught at the University of Liverpool, which is where I worked until August last year, that involved kind of using Facebook as a kind of integral part of the delivery of the course. So I'm going to tell you about what I did and why I did it, and then very briefly at the end I'm going to reflect a little bit on what worked and on the limitations of using Facebook in a kind of teaching and learning setting. So to give some kind of background to why I use Facebook, I just want to introduce myself briefly. So I've had a varied and quite strange career up to now. I'm originally a languages graduate.
Yay!
Tried to become a languages academic, couldn't get a job. So spent over a decade as a country analyst before finally kind of getting into the academic world in a business school. So worked at Liverpool for a couple of years, and I've been here for 3 or 4 months now. At Liverpool, I was sort of relatively at the last minute asked to lead a module on essentially doing business in emerging markets. And this was an elective module on Liverpool's MBA programme, and essentially to offer as wide a range of electives as possible. They came up with the idea of a learning pod, and what that meant was a relatively limited amount of contact time, so 8 hours over the course of a semester, with the focus being on a piece of kind of semi-independent research leading to a kind of 4,000 word almost mini dissertation. So there were a number of these. This was one of them, and it was a relatively small course, about 10 students. Being an MBA, 10 students from a wide range of backgrounds and nationalities, but all with the 3 years of kind of managerial level work experience, which was a requirement for entry to the MBA programme. And essentially, being an MBA, these guys were paying a lot of money and had a very sort of customer service approach to the kind of the experience that they were getting, and they weren't happy with the idea that they were doing an elective that had only 8 hours contact time. So there was a sort of disconnect, if you like, between what the department was trying to do with the learning pods and with student expectations. So the challenge that I faced kind of coming into that was kind of bridging that gap. So how to offer an experience that meets student expectations while only being able to offer 8 hours of actual contact time. So what I decided to do from the beginning was to try and offer as much kind of online complementary support, if you like, as possible. So the focus was the piece of research that they would be carrying out and the assignment that they would do. But what I tried to do was to supplement the very limited contact time with things like discussion boards on the virtual learning environment, and sort of encouraging the students to build up sort of peer-to-peer support networks, so that they were able to sort of have a more collaborative learning experience despite the relatively small amount of contact time. But what I found and what the students said to me is, we're paying all this money, and we're paying all this money for you, not to learn from each other. And they essentially either didn't get round to, or didn't want to, or just refused to use the tools that were set up through the virtual learning environment. So kind of in the middle of delivering a module, I was faced with the challenge of how to respond to that. And what I decided was, okay, getting the students to kind of go onto Blackboard, which was what Liverpool used, log on to a discussion board on the kind of course website was it was getting them to kind of do something that they wouldn't ordinarily do. So I thought, what would happen if I used a sort of platform that's kind of built into their everyday lives anyway. So I decided to try, rather than having these discussions through Blackboard, using Facebook. The idea being that, as I say, all of these students would be using Facebook constantly anyway. And a kind of supplementary benefit, if you like, of using Facebook was that, having worked in consultancy for quite a long time, I thought that this might allow me to bring in people from outside the module, and indeed outside the university, into the conversation. Bearing in mind that a key aim of most MBA students is networking, and given the kind of backgrounds that a lot of these students had, and the sort of careers that they would go into post-MBA, I thought that it was quite likely that some of my former colleagues and my professional associates from my consultancy days might actually be interested in engaging with these students. So what I did was I created a closed Facebook group, and the module was the kind of excuse for doing that, but I had the idea that if it was successful, essentially the group could kind of go on after the module had finished. So I created the group, invited students to subscribe, because I know that there are various views on being friends with students on Facebook. My personal view on it is that I don't want to be friends with current students on Facebook. So I invited the students to subscribe, and then I invited a fairly carefully selected range of other people, and they were both sort of academics working on this area, as well as former colleagues from consultancy and other people I knew who I thought would have something to contribute and an interest in being part of the group. And essentially, kind of what I did with it was, on the one hand, encourage the students to kind of post to the group about issues that they were facing with the piece of research that they were doing, so that there could be discussion around that. And then I kind of contributed media articles on big kind of current news issues that tied with some of the themes that the students were working on, to try and get a more general kind of discussion going. And I think actually it was relatively successful. I mean, the level of kind of student engagement, once we kind of moved off the virtual learning environment onto Facebook increased quite a lot. And there were also a core group of non-students who took part in the discussion, and I think that was very important to the success of the experiment. And what I found was that, particularly towards the end of it, it wasn't just me sort of leading the discussion. So students would post things, and some of the other people who I'd invited to take part would post things. And what that means is that we're now pretty much a year on. I was delivering the module this time last year, and the group is still somewhat active, albeit with a much smaller core group of people taking part in it. So, just to kind of wrap up, in terms of kind of things that I encountered and lessons that I've learned from this, I don't actually think that this sort of platform on Facebook would necessarily work for all the kinds of teaching that I do. So I'm not sure that I would do this, for example, with the kind of large undergraduate modules that I tend to teach on here. And I mean, that partly relates to the learning outcomes of those modules, and it partly relates to whether online collaboration and network is important to the module. So I think this was a relatively small group of MBA students, so older students with professional experience, who get the role of networking in professional life. And I think the fact that they kind of got that was important to this working as well as it did. Because, of course, if you're asking people who aren't students, who aren't members of the university, to take part, and they're doing that essentially either as a favour to you, or because they're interested in their own right. You have to kind of give them something that kind of keeps them engaged and keeps them interested. But at the same time, the challenge kind of as the challenge as the kind of leader of the discussion, if you like, is keeping that interest while also keeping the kind of focus of the discussion around what you're trying to do in the module more generally. And then obviously if you're working with social networking, and particularly with Facebook, privacy issues are important, and making sure that one is aware of those and takes steps to protect one's own privacy and the privacy of students, I think is central. So that, in a nutshell, is what I did, and I'd be happy to sort of talk about it further in questions.
Okay, thank you very much. Any questions? There is an attendance sheet going round, yellow. Have you all signed? Is it anywhere? Has anybody not signed the attendance? Okay, that's right. So we start. Yes.
With regards to the moderation of the Facebook group, how did you find, firstly keeping it on topic, and secondly avoiding perhaps controversial topics or arguments?
I think the size of the module made that relatively manageable. I think that would be a much bigger challenge with a larger group of students than it was for this one. I was fairly careful about the non-students who I invited, and I explained fairly carefully in the early stages of the contact time what the group was for. So I didn't encounter any serious issues of that kind. Having said that, if I was going to use Facebook for example, I'm teaching a large international business module here next semester, that would be something that I think I would have to be much more aware of and careful of.
Was a question? Yes.
There's a question.
Oh, okay, sorry.
Neil, what sort of moderation did you have to employ at the start? I'm thinking to actually promote interaction, as well as setting up the forums, but without any guidance. Usually either the interaction is between student and you and not peer-to-peer, or there's no interaction at all. Can you give us some tips as to how to produce that flourishing?
I think that's one of the beauties of Facebook, that people are accustomed to talking to each other more naturally through kind of commenting on posts on Facebook than they are in some of the forums that we would ordinarily use. What I did at the beginning, I was fairly active in kind of, as I say, posting news articles, maybe, for example, kind of IMF reports, blog posts, particularly from people I knew who were writing on relevant things, and maybe kind of asking a question, and kind of answering the question as a starting point in the conversation.
Okay, Dustin, do you still have that question? Or?
Yes,
All right.
I still have that
Go
question.
on then.
I just wanted to maybe ask something, but also suggest something. You say that you teach undergraduate modules as well.
Yeah.
Well, interestingly, I was at Glasgow University before I came here, and one idea that I presented at my interview was something called a virtual peer-assisted learning group. That may be one solution to a larger group. They've done quite a bit of research there. A lady named Sarah Honeychurch. Lots of research, and it's been very positive. Of course, they're not very structured, but she found that lots of people ended up acquiring academic, for example, ways of exchanging information, becoming more formal, supporting each other. But would that be something you might consider? Virtual peer-assisted learning groups?
I think by its nature, if you're using this sort of social network, it's much more. It becomes a much more kind of peer-to-peer process, even than a kind of Blackboard or a Moodle discussion forum. I still think. I do think that on a big module of the kind that we run in SAM, I think that would help, but I think that we would still have an issue of moderating the discussion. And then the scale of, the number of students involved, and the kind of the starting point of the students, if you like, given that MBAs kind of had that professional experience, I think would make it potentially a different experience. And I think, I actually did my first MOOC over the summer about online learning. And the main lesson that I took away from it is that a lot of people use online tools, including social networking, for the sake of it, essentially, and they don't fit with the learning outcomes, and they're not really relevant to the rest of the module, and that's when it tends to be less successful.
Yeah. Thanks, Thomas and then Jacques.
Just possibly an extension on Simon's question about moderation.
Yeah.
Given the sort of 24-hour culture of social media,
Yeah.
does this not encroach on your own? I assume you have a social life, personal life. You have to moderate if there is a potentially controversial topic addressed.
Yeah.
And it may happen in the evening when students are doing it, and you wouldn't
Yeah.
know unless you're continually monitoring it in the evening. So it has
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
implication. My other observational question would be: were any of your students Chinese? Because Facebook isn't allowed in China, is it? So the benefit for alumni to carry on their involvement with the group once they, assuming they return to China after their degree, is problematic. Most universities, their biggest international cohorts come from China, so maybe Facebook is.
Interestingly enough, of the kind of small group that still engages with this Facebook forum, none of them are Chinese. That cohort graduated last week, so they've sort of still been in the UK up to now. As far as moderation encroaching on personal time, again, I think that would potentially have been an issue had moderation been required. As I said, because of the nature of the group and the size of the group, there really wasn't any moderation required. But I assume that there's a lot of use really across the sector of discussion boards through Moodle or Blackboard, and I assume that's an issue kind of across the board. The potential for moderation to be required, sort of.
Why should we have to moderate them? Learning is a social process.
Sorry, Jacques.
Sorry to add that, but why should you have to moderate learners?
Because people abuse each other on Facebook.
We've had
That's the reason why.
I am doing intercultural with Mexico, and believe me, you need to moderate.
Yeah. That's probably the difference between using say Facebook and using Moodle. People are probably there's probably a greater propensity for people to abuse each other or to behave
Julie Salmon's book
inappropriately
is quite
using
informative, and the new edition, third edition, 2011, Julie Salmon immoderated. It's quite useful in that respect. Jacques, probably the last question.
I'm the academic conduct officer for our department. I had one occasion on one of my module Facebook pages this year when one student rashly posted a question: what is the answer to the following question, in a multiple choice quiz that I was running. Now it seems to me that when you've got this collaborative learning here, the potential danger is collusion, of course, in producing coursework by the students.
Yeah.
The larger the cohort, the greater the problem. And I'm wondering if that is something that you were aware of when you've got your students and all they're producing is a 4,000 piece of coursework. They're discussing it on Facebook.
I was aware of that, but because there was such an open choice of topics, and again there were only 10 students, there were 10 such distinctive topics that collusion wasn't an issue. What I'm hearing in this discussion is that this possibly works for this kind of teaching on this kind of module of this size. Whether it would work, there are examples of Facebook and Flickr and things like that being used very successfully in bigger, more mainstream modules, but obviously it raises a much wider range of challenges.
Simon, perhaps we round up. Yeah.
I started using Moodle for the first time many years ago in Taiwan, and it wasn't being used for anything else by the institution, and I found it very clunky. The students didn't understand it, I didn't understand it, and eventually we all just moved on to blogs. But having come back here, where Moodle is very much institutionalised, wise. It's a core administrative tool of the university.
Mm.
So in the same way as they're on Facebook every day anyway, in many modules, certainly at Coventry, students are on Moodle every day anyway.
Mm.
So I suppose, again, in a way, that's sort of, they're going to be there looking at things.
Yeah.
It's not as good an interface. It doesn't have the look and feel that your Facebook group probably has, but
I mean,
still, it's the platform really that's used for education. And you are on it every day.
I mean, my experience with Blackboard as we were using there was that going onto Blackboard was an event, if you like. Whereas using Facebook was something that people just did. Facebook, if you like, was kind of always there. It was almost like the cloud, to borrow a term. And that was the difference. I mean, interestingly, we've recently in SAM kind of looked at what proportion of students access Moodle. And Leanne may know better than me, but an amazing proportion of students never look at the Moodle pages for their modules.
Yeah, so
Absolutely huge. Yeah.
Can we just thank both speakers again? Well done.
At the beginning of his presentation, Hitler talks about the need for Germany to secure Lebensraum, living space, in order to secure the future of the German Aryan race. So, hotspot 1 lights up when the word Lebensraum is mentioned, and it takes you to, in this particular case, a piece by Professor Jäkel explaining Hitler's ideas about Germany's future, together with examples of more contemporary historians. And underneath each of these hotspots, there will be a number of questions to try to direct the students' minds in terms of what they're picking up from the information that they're receiving. So all of the hotspots will be in this particular kind of format, with lots of documentary evidence, because one of the things we also want to do as historians, and I'm sure plenty of other people in this room want to do as well, I need to put my arm down, sorry. Some of my students say this about me. Is to get the students involved with the evidential basis for the assertions that they're later going to make. And so this is one way of trying to, in the new environment in which we're teaching and learning, to get the students engaged in that evidential basis that they need to understand in order to get the very best marks, which we all, of course, want them to achieve. And finally, in the final hotspot, there will be this timeline to take them all the way through the period from 1933 to 39. And this is something that and what happens is, as you run through the timeline from 33, you see the development of German policy to the point where Hitler believes he has the opportunity now to take advantage of the weakness of Britain and France in particular. And in each of these hotspots there are various links to video material, YouTube material, documents, for example. So once you click on one, the music stops and the associated link will play for them. This is about the remilitarisation of the Rhineland on Saturday the 7th of March 1936, which was a particularly important turning point in securing Germany's frontiers in the west, which of course were a necessary precursor before any advance could take place in the east. And so all the links will be of a similar nature, to give the students more and more background, more and more information, to try to ensure that they can understand the developments of German policy in particular. There's a particularly large pair of spectacles, I don't know where you got those from. So that's what we'll play right at the end, to put the whole conference within the context, as I say, of German policy in the 1930s. And that, I think, is all I want to say. Thank you very much for your attention, of course.
Well, that gives us 2 extra minutes for questions.
Yes, sir.
I'd like to.
So, thanks very much for that, and it's very interesting. And I'm just trying to visualise what the students have got there. So there's a 300, there's like a panel.
No, it'll be as if they were there. They can look around the room.
Around the
Yeah.
room. And the speech or the discussion
Yeah, well, with his there's very little discussion.
is going on.
That's right.
And there's a transcript for that, is there? So we know exactly what was said.
Yes, we do. We've got the evidential record, and the voiceover has already been undertaken. Naturally, in my inimitable diplomatic fashion, I asked a German colleague to do it, which he was happy to do. So that's what we'll do. And as the particular point that I want to highlight in this delivery, like Lebensraum, there will be a hotspot which will light up, and what I want in that particular case is to take them to a map of Hitler's geographic intentions all the way to the Urals.
So hotspot is a link.
It will be, yes.
So it's a hotspot in the sense that it's an item in the.
It's flashing to tell them that there's more information on that particular point that Hitler's making at that moment.
Which is a map or a book.
It could be, yes, yes.
Earlier in the room.
Indeed, or a documentary base, anything like that. That's the plan, anyway. Yes, sir.
Could you go into a bit more detail on the process of actually getting it done with the SGI and what investment and time scale? Please.
The Director of Teaching and Learning, as you can hear, This particular project is quite an expensive one. And without the support of the Executive Dean and indeed Paul, this would not have got off the ground. But what it is showing, it's an exemplar of what can be done. And as we're working through this, we've got other members of staff in ISS who are now had these ideas in mind, have been aware of this, and are now developing their own projects using software to create their own simulations. I hope you don't mind if I steal your thunder, Darren. Darren Reed and Brett are working on a simulation to deal with slavery in the Caribbean. And in this particular case, they're not going to be working with the SGI, they're using a platform which we're endeavouring to buy a license for from the net, which is a very much cheaper enterprise. But the principles will be much the same, because the great expense here is producing the simulation, the accurate simulation of the study itself, to try and immerse the students in actually being at that conference at that time. So although this is quite expensive, these software packages we're talking about $100 a time. And, as I understand it, Miranda will correct me if I'm wrong, but once you've paid that $100, you can use what you've produced in a commercial sense, which is something else that we've been thinking about with regard to this sort of...
Frank also started working on this before we even had the LEU in place, so this project dates about 2 years.
Oh no, it's not long that long. Just seems that way.
Well, it's 18 months.
Oh yeah, it is, yeah. Yeah.
Okay, two last questions, James and Tim, then move on to Neil. Okay.
That's really good. I was just wondering, do you think there's any potential for actually making it more like a game? I mean, it looks like a computer game.
Of course, some of this is coming at the back of, you know, the gamification idea.
Yeah, so whether, you know,
So,
they can make decisions.
Well, yeah, this is the thing. I did wonder about having a rerun of the Second World War, so you interview. But you know, with my historian's hat on, I don't think I can quite go down.
They could look at two different documents, which...
Yeah, but then you have the historical record, wouldn't you? And then you have the counterfactual history, which whatever you said could be right. I know what you mean, though. I thought
that could be quite interesting.
it could be, especially if the outcome changes. Yes.
Yes, I have a question.
Sorry, Dustin, Tim was first.
Oh, sorry.
Remember
He
the last
can go.
question.
You can't see us though. That's
Okay, I'll let you go your way with it. Then Tim is after, then we finish. Okay, Dustin.
Sorry. The question I have is, there's a turn in higher education for materials going open access and Creative Commons.
Yes.
And obviously, if this is something you can showcase, it might be more beneficial to do that. Has that been considered?
It certainly has. One of the problems associated with this, and this has been very much a learning curve for me, and I must admit I've learned an awful lot in quite a short time from Amanda Fitz and all the other people in the Learning Enhancement Unit, and indeed what's going on in the DMLO as well, as a consequence of this. One of the issues associated with this is exactly that point about license, and how one can use these materials in a more broader context. And it certainly has been thought of, but it is a particular restriction at the moment, because many of these documentary links and links from sources in the library are linked through Curve and Equella into Moodle. But the licensing agreement for that digitisation to take place only allows students who are presently on a particular module to look at those sources. So we would have to redraft if we wanted to go down a commercial application. And believe me, the idea of a commercial application is not very far from my mind at all. In fact, it was right at the front of it when I was thinking about doing this. But I'm hoping that what Darren and Brett are working on in ISS as well, we may be able to develop these packages using the software that they're using, and having that copyright and license in order to have these packages not only to enhance the reputation of the university, but I'm hoping that matters such as this might be used on open days, for example. Just the front intro could be used on open days, might be a little bit different. But certainly the commercial application is something we are looking at very much.
Okay, Tim, last question.
Yeah, I was just wondering how much thought you've given to how you actually use it on present courses. I mean, is it entirely intended as open access, self-access, or will it be used in classes at all?
At the moment, it's going to be used in a specialised timetabling arrangements made for the delivery of this particular aspect of this particular module. But one of the reasons why I wanted to come along today was to see what other people had to say about it and the ideas that they have. Because I know that we don't operate in a silo mentality. We don't deliberately do that. But I know there are lots and lots of people across the university doing lots and lots of things. But that's how we see this not this project, sorry, this particular project working at the moment is going to be embedded within a module.